Welcome to the Sexual Helix, a series exploring how the body organises, responds, and relates under pressure. This isn't about performance or technique. It's about understanding the system of the body and what becomes possible when it no longer feels the need to hold. I'm Madonna, creator of SomaFlow and the Helical healing method, and this series is an exploration of how those ideas extend beyond movement into how we experience pressure, connection, and response. There are moments in this work where something doesn't just make sense, it lands, not in the mind, but in the body. And when something lands like that, it doesn't feel like you've learned something new. It feels like you've remembered something that was already there. This was one of those moments. This series is called the Sexual Helix, and before anything else, it's important to be clear. This isn't about sex. And I want to stay here for a moment because the name creates expectation. People hear it and assume this is going to be about intimacy in a familiar way, something they've learned before, something they've heard, something they already understand. But this isn't that. This isn't about doing something better. It's not about technique. It's not about performance. It's about understanding something more clearly. It's about recognizing what the body is already doing when it's not being controlled. And that's a completely different starting point. As you're listening to this, you don't need to try and understand everything straight away. Just notice. Notice your body. Notice if there's tension, if there's a sense of holding, or even just a subtle sense of effort that you weren't aware of before. Because that's where this begins. In SomaFlow, this is always where we start, not with performance or outcome, but with a much simpler question. How is the body organising itself right now? Not how it looks, not whether it's right or wrong, but how is it organising? Where is it gripping? And that grip isn't always obvious. It doesn't always feel like tension. Sometimes it feels like effort or like control. Sometimes it even feels like strength. But underneath that, there's often a lack of support. Where is the body bracing? Where is it preparing or protecting or trying to stabilize instead of respond? And equally important, where is it supported? Because the body doesn't hold randomly. It holds when it doesn't feel supported. It holds when it doesn't trust that something underneath it will carry the load. And when support becomes available, something changes. And that change isn't dramatic. It doesn't suddenly look different. It doesn't create an immediate external shift, but internally there's a reorganization. The body doesn't feel like it needs to hold everything together. It doesn't feel like it needs to brace or like it needs to prepare for something it can't manage. And instead it begins to respond. And that response is subtle. It's not something you perform. It's something you notice, a softening, a redistribution, a sense that effort is shared instead of being held in one place. And when that happens, the system starts to organise differently. This is where movement changes, not because you've forced it to change, but because the conditions inside the body have changed. And over time, you begin to see this everywhere. Not just in movement, you see it in how people stand, how they walk, how they breathe, how they carry themselves. And eventually you begin to see it in how people relate, how they respond to pressure or closeness or being seen, because the same pattern exists across all of it. The same holding, the same bracing, and the same attempt to control instead of respond. And once you start to recognize that, it becomes very difficult to unsee. You begin to understand that what you're looking at isn't just behavior, it's organization, and that's where everything begins to shift. At some point, without trying to, I realized something. I was teaching a class. We were working through hip extension, bridges, support through the back of the body, the organization of the pelvis. And I placed my hands at the front of my hips, forming a V shape down towards the pubic bone. It's a cue that I use often to map the pelvic triangle of support, the glutes, the inner thighs, and the posterior chain working together. And I stayed there for a moment because this is something people don't always feel clearly. They might feel effort or activation, but they don't always feel where the support is actually coming from. So this becomes a way of bringing awareness to that space, not to change it immediately, but just to notice it. And like I often do, I reference something familiar, the general shape people associate with a hip thrust, as a shared reference point for direction, for how force moves through the pelvis. There's usually a bit of laughter when I say it, but this time something didn't just pass through, it stayed. Because what I was cueing in that moment wasn't separate from anything else. It was the same system, the same direction of force, the same organisation, and the same relationship to pressure. And that's where the shift happened, because we tend to think more in terms of force, doing, pushing, creating movement. We think of movement as something we generate, something we make happen, one action leading to another, one person acting, the other person responding. But the body doesn't actually work like that. The body doesn't organise itself through force alone. It organises through pressure. And that's a completely different experience. Force is something we apply, pressure is something we receive, something we experience, and more importantly, something we respond to. Pressure enters the system and then something happens. The body either holds, braces, resists, or it receives. And that moment, that decision, even if it's unconscious, changes everything. Because when the body holds, the system becomes rigid. Movement becomes limited, effort increases, and everything becomes more controlled, more predictable, more linear. But when the body receives, it organises, it adapts, it redistributes, and that reorganisation is what creates movement. Not just the force itself, and this is where the pelvis becomes something else entirely. Not just a structure, not a group of muscles, but a system that receives, adapts, responds, and returns. In SomaFlow, we understand this through 3 key ideas. The pelvic triangle of support, where force is generated and transferred through the back of the body. The pelvic bowl, which receives and distributes pressure. And the pelvic floor, not as something that switches on or off, but as something that responds, something that moves, that yields and recoils, something that adapts in real time. And when these parts are working together, the system doesn't need to hold, it doesn't need to brace, and it doesn't need to control everything. It can receive. And when it receives, something else begins to emerge. Because when the body is holding, everything becomes linear. There's direction, effort, and control. Movement becomes something you do, something you push through, something you try to get right. But when the body becomes responsive, that begins to change. It's no longer just push, receive, repeat. It becomes something cyclical, something adaptive, something that changes moment to moment. And this is where the helix begins to appear. Not as something abstract or theoretical, but as something you can feel. A repeating pattern. Pressure enters, it is received, the system organises, and then it returns. And each time that cycle happens, something shifts. It's not the same, it deepens. It becomes more responsive, more connected, more aware. And this isn't something you create. It's something that emerges when the body no longer feels the need to hold. Most people never experience this, not because they're doing something wrong, not because they're not trying hard enough, but because the body is protecting itself. It holds, it braces, it disconnects, and often that's not even conscious. It's not a decision, it's a pattern, a learned response, something the body has developed over time in order to feel safe, to feel stable and in control. And those patterns don't just exist in movement. They exist in how we relate, how we respond to pressure and closeness and uncertainty, because holding isn't just physical. It's behavioural, it's emotional, and it's relational. We hold when we don't feel safe. We brace when we don't trust the outcome. We disconnect when we don't know how to stay present. And when that happens, everything becomes simpler, more controlled, more predictable, more linear, but also less responsive, less adaptive, and less alive. Because responsiveness requires something very different. It requires the ability to receive, to feel something without immediately trying to control it, to stay present when something enters the system, to allow the body to organise in real time. And that's not always easy, because for many people, receiving feels unfamiliar, it feels vulnerable, it feels uncertain. There's a tendency to override it, to move quickly into doing, into controlling, and into creating an outcome, because that feels safer, it feels more predictable. But what gets lost in that process is the body's ability to respond. And when the body can't respond, it can only repeat the same patterns, the same strategies, the same way of holding. And that's where things start to feel stuck, not because the body is broken, but because it's no longer adapting. And this is why this matters. Because when the body begins to feel supported enough, aware enough, something shifts. It begins to let go of that holding. Not all at once and not dramatically, but gradually. And when it does, it doesn't collapse, it doesn't lose control or become unstable. It responds, it adapts, and it reorganises. And that response is where everything changes. Because now the body is no longer relying on force alone, it's no longer relying on effort alone, it's no longer trying to control everything that happens, it's participating in what's happening. And that participation is very different from performance. Performance is something you do, something you manage, something you try to get right. Participation is something you are in, something you experience and respond to. And when you begin to feel that difference, everything changes, movement changes, it becomes more efficient, more connected, less forced. But more importantly, your relationship to your body changes. You stop trying to control it. You stop trying to override it. You start listening to it. And when you start listening, you start recognizing patterns. Where you hold, where you brace, where you disconnect. Not as something wrong, but as something understandable. Something that developed for a reason. And something that can change. And this is where this work extends beyond movement. Because the same thing shows up everywhere. In how you respond to pressure, how you respond to conflict, how you respond to closeness, how you respond to being seen. There is always a moment where something enters the system and the body decides, do I hold or do I respond? Do I brace or do I receive? Do I control or do I stay present? And most of the time that decision isn't conscious. It's patterned, it's automatic. And when awareness increases, that begins to change. You start to notice the moment. You start to feel the shift. You start to recognize when the body is moving into holding, and that awareness alone creates space, not to force a different outcome, but to allow a different response. And this is where the helix becomes something more than just a concept. It becomes something lived, something experienced, something you can feel in real time, not just in movement, but in how you exist, how you relate, and how you respond to life. Because the pattern is the same. Pressure enters, the body receives, it organises, and it returns. And each time that happens, something deepens. Awareness increases, responsiveness increases, and the need to hold decreases. And this is not something you achieve. It's not something you perform. It's not something you get right. It's something that becomes available. When the body no longer feels the need to protect itself in the same way. And that takes time, it takes awareness, it takes repetition. But more than anything, it takes support. Because without support, the body will always choose holding. It will always choose control. It will always choose what feels safest. And this work isn't about removing that, it's about creating the conditions where something else becomes possible. Where the body begins to trust, where it begins to respond, where it begins to organise in a way that doesn't rely on force alone. And this is what we'll continue to explore in this series. Not how to do something, not how to perform something, but how to recognize what is already happening and what becomes possible when the body no longer needs to hold in the same way. In the next episode, we'll begin to look more closely at the pelvis itself, not just as a structure, but as a system that plays a central role in how the body receives, organises, and responds to pressure, because understanding that system changes everything. The body is always communicating how it's organising. The question is whether you're listening.